Well, thank you. The stories we hear of the old days, there's one thing that certainly I don't relish looking back, relish the jobs of the presidents during the 80s, because the 80s was the decade where the government discovered a thing called regulation. And the things that I was listening to Gordon's stories before and even Neil's stories, some of the things that were related there, basically these days you probably get locked up. You would be charged, locked up, fined heavily, and also probably never be allowed to be part of the Essendon Football Club ever again. The 80s, 22% interest rates for anyone below 40 years of age. Just think of the concept of 22% interest rates for business, 18% on your housing loans. Don't whinge. They were, in many ways, very difficult economic times. However, rallying in its own way, they were very much very bright years for rallying. I remember coming up to moving to Wangaratta deliberately. I wasn't sent here, but I purchased the pharmacy in Phillipson Street, and Neil Ottaway came into the pharmacy at about 10 a.m. on the first day that I was trading, and reintroduced himself, because Neil was one of the people who I knew through rallying before I moved to Wangaratta, along with people like Bill Agenbach and Bevan Weston. Actually, I didn't really know Laurie. And Neil comes in and says, "Look, we've got a club meeting on, I think it was the Wednesday night. Would have been the Wednesday night. Never has not been Wednesday nights." And Neil comes in and says, "Look, you know, we'd love you to join. We know who you are, and come along." And I said, "Neil, I really appreciate that. Flemmo beat you by half an hour." The late Alan Fleming had beat him by 9:30. So rallying was, when I came to the North Eastern Car Club, I'd been actively involved in rallying in Melbourne. I'd been a member of foundation. My first car club was CCR&IT. I was involved in Mitsubishi because I had the privilege of rallying at that stage a very, very nice Mitsubishi Lancer, which Kenjiro Shinozuka had used in Southern Crosses. And when I came to Wang, I came along with one of the ex-Repco Commodores. I didn't actually get to compete in the Round Australia, but I ended up with one of the cars. Now, unfortunately, that car got rolled into a ball in the mid-90s, so imagine what that car would be worth now.
Which one?
The Canberra car. Canberra car. The girls, Jean Jones. Yep. Anyway, the times were, the North Eastern Car Club was absolutely flying. I think the North Eastern Car Club in the Riverina series, which was this fabulous regional series which Aubrey Wagga, Wang and Shep ran at the time, the Shep Car Club ran at the time, was considered, well, it was almost, I would say it was the equal of Victorian Championship events, certainly in quality and the way they were run. The car club could probably field 25 competitive cars within at that particular period of time, and it was the zenith of what was known as Group G. The 80s, as I say, were difficult economic times. Paul Keating, as our illustrious treasurer, did an astonishing thing in 1986 when he deregulated the dollar. A lot of us sort of thought, well, that's terrific, what does that mean? For many of us, it meant that Australia became very internationalised, and along with the deregulation of the dollar, things like import restrictions were dropped. Because one of the things that when you had a competition car of any decent form or any overseas heritage meant that you needed the overseas parts, and they were very, very difficult to acquire, particularly works parts. Very difficult to acquire. So what ended up happening there was we were on a cusp where there was an increasing, so many changes were occurring. We had rallies were evolving from navigational to fully special stage, which meant that you would throw the maps out of the window. You just didn't need them anymore because you had this lovely set of instructions which Neil and his cronies introduced, which told you exactly where to go, at which time and how long, what the distance was between the various points. Didn't need a map anymore. At the same time, we also had people emerging whose professionalism was profound. People from this area like George Fury, other people like Jeff Portman. In fact, Jeff was in this area for a while when he was studying. I remember he had an FE Holden at the time, I think, when he was in the northeast, with and in the northeastern car club. Interstate, we had people like Ed Ordinsky were starting their rally careers in absolutely standard Corollas. So what the 80s became was a funnel for two things. It was a funnel for change, it was a funnel for internationalisation. The biggest change was when CAMS announced in their wisdom, and some would argue 30 years later how wise it was, that we would adapt the international formula of Group A for rallying. Some of us thought, oh yeah, that's all right, we'll go along with that, without really knowing what it all meant. Whereas the concept of rallying had been so strong in regional Australia particularly, because rallying was motorsport of the bush. And on top of that, anyone who was half-handy with their hands could actually make a competitive rally car in the tool shed if they had the right tools and they had enough know-how. The bits didn't have to come from the manufacturers in Japan or Europe. The bits could come off someone's lathe that they used to keep the farm machinery going. That was a profoundly obvious thing to anyone who lived in rural areas, but it was something that CAMS totally and completely misunderstood when they said, right, let's go Group A. Some of us got on board. Cost me a bomb. I don't know about anyone else in the room who got it. I thought it was terrific. Boy, was it a path of spiralling. Gee, will we get a new bedroom on the house, or will we get a rally? I think everyone's faced that dilemma, but I won't mention Kitchens, Christine, that's sort of a bit of a bugbear at the moment. But at the same time, with the increasing costs, I mean, I think I paid, when I was running the Lancer, I was buying the best of Yokohama's works tyres for $36 for the Lancer. That was about 1981, so put that into today's terms and see how you go. At the same time, though, a lot of organisations started to recognise that this rallying cable was a bit of a good thing to hang sponsorship onto. So there was, in fact, quite readily available sponsorship for the average guy who could probably end up at the pointy end of a VRC or an Australian Championship event. That had probably not been seen as much before, and it was also a time when a lot of major national and multinational companies went from their sponsorship being a benevolent gesture to a car club or an organisation into a results-driven, you must end up on telly, you must have so many column metres of newspaper because I've given you X number of dollars to go rallying, I want to see your car's name up in lights and our product featured therewith. Today it's called F1 and V8 supercars. There were so many changes going on. The three-tiered structure was very important from the point of view of where you could go. There were three levels and they were all competitive. Today it's very difficult to find a decent level of event, but that's something that the guys later on can talk about. In the late 80s, Rally Oz came along and suddenly there was a compulsion to try to line up all the local cars with the international regulations so that the organisers of Rally Australia could fill the field. But fundamentally, I think the biggest change, which we didn't know till 20 years later, was that when Group G died, the powers that be, which at the time was CAMS, and I agreed with what they were doing at the time, robbed the clubs of customers because so many cars went into sheds that we really didn't recover, and the sport in many respects hasn't recovered. While I'm up here, as president of Benalla Auto Club, which I've held for a couple of years now, the Benalla Auto Club would like to extend its congratulations to the North Eastern Car Club on its 60th anniversary. BAC is only 55. Hopefully it will always be 5 years behind, because it means if it catches up, then this organisation isn't there. The changes to clubs that are occurring in the last few years are profound, but I think that organisations that keep their head above water, keep a few members with a like-minded interest, will always survive. Congratulations to North Eastern Car Club.